I do not recommend this, but if you deprive yourself of sleep for a long time, then at some point you may begin to sense someone's presence and hear things that you should not hear. Beyond your own inner voice, you will start to catch very real, completely foreign, and uncontrollable voices, individual words, fragments of phrases, or even entire sentences. This is a well-known phenomenon called hypnagogic hallucinations, a state resembling symptoms of schizophrenia, but usually occurring in healthy people on the border between sleep and wakefulness in moments of severe fatigue or stress. According to statistics, many people have experienced such hallucinations before sleep at least once in their lives. And it was precisely this state that caused thousands of claims about nightly contact with aliens. Humanity looks into the cosmos with childlike wonder and burning hope. We listen to the silence of the universe, dreaming of catching the whisper of another form of life. Scientists and science fiction authors have spent many decades trying to guess how remarkable it might be. But what if, in this silence, someone actually answers us? And what if I tell you that you are right now witnessing such an exotic form of life that you are not even ready to hear about it? Not simply unprepared, but so unprepared that I have already mentioned it directly, but you were simply incapable of paying attention to it. By the way, it is not about extraterrestrials, and even if you rewind and listen again, it will not help. And if I tell you directly what we are talking about right now, everything will only get worse. You will decide that I have completely lost my mind and will not listen further. That is how alien this form of life is, how different from everything we know. And the place where it inhabits is, without exaggeration, the last place where you would think to look. Everything in your head will only come together after significant preparation. And then, most likely, you will feel uncomfortable. Let me lay the cards on the table. If I were awarding a prize for the best idea in history, I would give it to Darwin, not Newton, Einstein, or any other thinker. Evolution through natural selection is not simply a remarkable scientific idea. This idea is dangerous. From the book, The Dangerous Idea of Darwin, by Daniel Dennett, a cognitive scientist and one of the most influential philosophers of our time. Natural selection has become for each of us merely another boring chapter from a school textbook. But in reality, in 1859, Charles Darwin discovered something incredible. He tore away the veil from one of the fundamental laws of the universe, one as merciless and inevitable as gravity itself. Something that permeates the entire universe. Not simply some law of biology on Earth. No, Darwin himself, not realizing it, uncovered a universal mechanism governing the development of life at any point in the universe. Whether on a green and blue planet, in methane oceans, in the atmosphere of gas giants, or in the eternal darkness of icy worlds far from their stars. What is this mechanism in 2 words? To demonstrate the law of gravity, you need a massive object. To demonstrate Darwin's law, you need an object that creates its own copies, the so-called replicator. When a replicator appears, the inevitable mathematics of the real world begins. Copying is never absolutely precise. Errors appear in copies, or as we say, mutations. Most mutations prevent replicators from copying correctly, and such copies die out. But some errors turn out to be useful, and copies with such mutations reproduce more effectively than others. Thus, generation after generation, improvements accumulate. And all the life that you see on our planet is the result of copying replicators. We call these replicators genes. Genes are responsible for all biological evolution to this day. Now behold the monstrous power of this simple mechanism. If you look at our planet from space, you will notice that it is quite green. Well, all the greenery you see is the result of replication of the first self-copying molecule that arose on Earth approximately 4 billion years ago. You would not see this molecule even in the most powerful light microscope, but it is precisely this that launched a chain reaction, the result of which you now see from space. So the Darwin algorithm, like gravity, can acquire truly cosmic scales. Once it arises, a replicator clings to existence with fatal persistence, taking on ever new forms and adapting to any environment. Completely sterilizing a planet infected with replicators is practically impossible, even if a giant meteorite crashes into it. This is precisely why all spacecraft directed, for example, to Mars and other celestial bodies, undergo the strictest disinfection. A single bacterium from Earth will be enough that under certain conditions, the relentless Darwin algorithm would allow it to adapt and reproduce even in such a hostile place. This would forever deprive us of the ability to know whether life exists on Mars, or whether it originated independently there. What is also important to understand is that replicators do not simply passively adapt to environmental conditions, but also very actively change this environment for their own needs. For example, replicators created literally an entire cosmic shield around our planet that protects them from deadly ultraviolet radiation. This shield is the ozone layer. It is also a consequence of the chain of events launched by the very first replicator. Of course, replicators have no purpose, and certainly no consciousness. This is only the work of a blind mathematical process. Simply, those replicators whose random mutations directly or even indirectly improved conditions for their copying survived more often. In short, the actions of known laws of nature, among which the Darwin algorithm plays a key role, can explain the origin of any life forms we know. Any, except for one single exception. 6 million years ago, one ape gave birth to 2 daughters. One of them became the ancestor of all living chimpanzees today. The second became the mother of all humanity. Of all the animals existing on Earth, chimpanzees are our closest relatives. They are interesting and complex creatures, but no one has the slightest doubt that they fit perfectly within the framework of the typical animal world. We understand the logic of their evolution, but the evolution of humans looks rather like an endless series of anomalies against the backdrop of not only any other animals, but even against our closest relative, the chimpanzee. The rapid history of humans seems not simply strange, it seems impossible. We simply do not know of any comparable example of why we, having diverged from a single point just 6 million years ago, became so radically different that one branch remained in the forest, while the other built entire civilizations, engaged in conversations about its own existence, and developed a sense of inner self. Are we so different from other animals because aliens created us, or even God? These would be far too poor answers. Perhaps we have some special genes. No, our DNA in composition and size is not more complex than the DNA of a field mouse. I am going to express an opinion that may seem unexpected, that in order to understand the evolution of modern humans, we must abandon the gene as the sole basis of our understanding of evolution. This is a dangerous statement. This explosive statement in 1976 was made not by some madman, but by Richard Dawkins himself, the famous biologist and science popularizer, in his revolutionary book called The Selfish Gene. Again, Richard Dawkins. Is not he one of the main defenders of the gene-centered view of evolution? Right in his book, in black and white, he writes that the familiar biological laws of evolution are cracking when it comes to humans, and that in addition to genetic evolution, something else, something strange, is happening to humans. Certainly, our DNA can tell us much about ourselves. It tells us about genetic predispositions, nutritional needs, and health risks. All of this scientific information is valuable. From such genetic analysis, without leaving home, we can learn about genetic predispositions to various conditions and traits. We can understand our ancestral origins and our genetic makeup. But the fact remains that human DNA alone does not explain the anomalies of human evolution. There is something about us that does not fit the standard evolutionary framework when viewed through genetics alone. Our abilities, our capacity for language, our sense of humor, our artistic expression, our ability to create complex societies and technologies, our sense of abstract morality, these seem to require more explanation than simply pointing to our genes. And this is where we must begin to consider an entirely different mechanism. Not something that replaces natural selection, but something that works alongside it. Something that emerged in human evolution and has been accelerating ever since. The question becomes, what else, besides our genes, could be driving human evolution forward at such an astonishing rate? What else could explain why our brains are so absurdly large, so metabolically expensive, so far beyond what natural selection alone would seem to require? These are the questions that will lead us, step by step, toward understanding something remarkable. Something that has been hiding in plain sight all along. Something that Charles Darwin could not have known about because it was only discovered scientifically in 1976. The human brain is enormous. If you compare it with any other creatures on the planet, our brain is far too large for our body. Do you know how much larger it is than it should be? Approximately 600%. Taking the average human body mass and average brain mass, it is almost 7 times larger than expected if we follow general biological logic. Of course, this is a crude method of assessment, but it is nonetheless revealing. Why our brain is so enormous, no one knows for certain. From school onwards, you have heard a million times that the human brain evolved to solve problems characteristic of the lifestyle of hunter-gatherers. Is this really so? Let us look at it carefully. We invented refrigerators, internal combustion engines, and rocket technology. We can play chess, football, and computer games. We listen to music, dance, and sing. And we created democracy, systems of social welfare, money, and the stock market. It does not seem like such tasks would fit into the daily needs of hunter-gatherers from 300,000 years ago. Yet their brains back then were in no way different from the brains of modern humans. Of course, there exist many theories about the origin of our enormous brain, but none of them have yet achieved general acceptance. From the point of view of evolution, the human brain is not simply excessive in its abilities, it is absurd. Everyone has heard many times that our brain, a single organ, consumes as much as 20% of all the body's energy. You have heard that such energy would be enough to power an entire light bulb, but here it is important to add something crucial. The brain consumes so much energy even when you are doing absolutely nothing, lying around or staring at a wall or even sleeping, 20%. And for a child, this figure reaches as high as 60%. Up to about 5 years of age, more than half of the body's resources go to a single organ. From the point of view of biological evolution, this is madness. One might say that a large brain is not an unnecessary thing, and you would be right. Yes, but only evolution does not work in the categories of just in case, and it is guided by strict mathematics. Evolutionary logic always orients itself toward what exists now, not toward what will be. Natural selection is blind and cannot make any long-term predictions. Those replicators that adapt to the environment here and now reproduce better. Therefore, evolution without hesitation cut off our ancestors' tail, which objectively would have been useful in a million scenarios, but nevertheless still slightly reduced survival efficiency. But the brain, which devours energy like an inadequate creature, evolution not only left it unchanged, but hypertrophied it to a size that contradicts any efficiency whatsoever. One might say that a large brain allowed ancient people to hunt effectively and navigate space. Yes, but this is like building a nuclear reactor to boil a kettle. It is as if evolution, trying to create more efficient counting beads from a school cafeteria, suddenly assembled a quantum supercomputer. A large brain is so expensive that if you could catch prey with a slightly smaller brain, you would have an evolutionary advantage, and you would be more likely to pass on your genes. This is precisely why many predatory animals hunt brilliantly with a brain 10 times smaller than humans. As for navigation of the terrain, even animals with tiny brains, from city rats to squirrels, manage to create complex cognitive maps of vast territories, for example, to find their way to their countless caches of supplies or food sources. But human evolution, contrary to obvious calculation, persistently made our brain larger and larger. All these facts suggest that some powerful and consistent selection pressure was acting on the size of our brain in the direction of its increase. But what exactly is this secret? Moreover, it is not simply a matter of overall brain size, but of what exactly expanded. The areas responsible for basic functions, breathing, sleep, emotions, remained relatively unchanged. If we compare the brain of a human with the brains of other primates, we will see that abnormal expansion occurred specifically in the frontal lobe. But what is particularly important is this part, the prefrontal cortex. Here we come up against the main mystery, because neurobiology has still not given a clear and exhaustive answer to the question of what exactly the prefrontal cortex does. And clinical cases only add fuel to the fire. For example, there was a railroad worker named Phineas Gage, whose prefrontal cortex was pierced by a giant metal rod in 1848. Just look at this computer model of his horrific injury. Due to the wound, Gage lost most of the frontal lobe of his left hemisphere, but despite this, he lived another 12 years. And although his personality changed significantly, at first meeting, you would not immediately realize that something was wrong with him. Or take, for example, patients who underwent lobotomy. Lobotomy was used to treat severe mental illness. The treatment, in essence, consisted of disconnecting the prefrontal cortex. During the procedure, a special instrument was used to sever the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. Yes, this often helped with treating the symptoms of the disease, but the side effects of this operation were quite catastrophic. Apathy, impulsivity, impaired ability to plan, and so on and so forth. The list is long. But on the other hand, considering the scale of the damage, the negative changes seem surprisingly moderate. And therefore, for a long time, lobotomy was considered rather successful than mutilating practice. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people worldwide went through this procedure. To what am I getting at? Take any animal and deprive it of that part of the body on which evolution made its main bet. If you shorten a giraffe's neck, cut short a cheetah's legs, gouge out an eagle's eyes, or deafen a bat, they will all inevitably and very quickly die. If you brutally sever a human's prefrontal cortex, they will be told, "You are healthy, you can be discharged." I am of course exaggerating, but nevertheless a reasonable question arises. What the hell is going on here? It is not surprising that if you open a reference source, hoping to learn what the prefrontal cortex does, you will encounter a formulation that is perplexing. The basic function of this area of the brain is the organization of thoughts and actions in accordance with internal goals. Many authors point to the inseparable connection between will and life, personality, and the functions of the prefrontal cortex. Think about this carefully. Evolution, a blind and strictly mathematical process, consistently for millions of years, makes its main bet not on speed or strength, but on the development of an area of the brain responsible for personality and will to live. What? This adds mystery to the entire story. There is something fundamentally wrong with our understanding of human evolution. There is one disease that adds mystery to this entire situation. This disease is schizophrenia, and the prefrontal cortex plays a key role in its manifestation. Does anything similar to schizophrenia occur in other species? No, it does not. According to Darwin's laws, schizophrenia is not adaptive. People with schizophrenia have much lower chances of having offspring than healthy relatives. According to all calculations, powerful selection should work against it. Nevertheless, schizophrenia occurs in 1 to 2% of the population across the entire planet. Historical data reliably indicate that schizophrenia has always existed. The fact that schizophrenia persists, despite being deeply disadvantageous from an evolutionary standpoint, is itself puzzling. If it reduced reproductive success so dramatically, why has it not been eliminated from the population? The origin of humans is such a puzzling story that even Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist and biologist, and the man who independently from Darwin discovered the principle of natural selection, admitted that he could not explain human intellectual abilities within the framework of evolution. In the end, he even seriously came to the conviction that humans are the product of supernatural intervention, and that human consciousness is capable of existing independently from the body. And indeed, how can we explain, in the context of science without all this spiritualistic nonsense, why we have a strong inner feeling that our personality and body are not the same thing? We even use formulations in the most bureaucratic language devoid of any philosophy, like, the body of Citizen A was found at 12:30, as if Citizen A and his body were not one and the same. This inner sense of separation between self and body is universal among humans. We instinctively feel that who we are is not identical to our physical form. This intuition is so strong that it appears in our language, our art, our religions, and our philosophies. From ancient times to the present day, humans have spoken of the soul, the spirit, the mind, the self. All of these terms reflecting the belief that something essential about us is separate from our physical bodies. Yet from a purely biological perspective, this makes no sense. We are physical beings, made of matter and governed by the laws of physics and biology. There should be nothing in us that is separate from our bodies. And yet, this sense of inner self, this feeling of being a consciousness inhabiting a body, is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. What could explain this paradox? Why would natural selection create creatures who feel fundamentally split between mind and body? Why would it create the illusion of consciousness as something separate from the physical brain? The answer, it turns out, requires us to look beyond genetics to another form of replicator entirely. Here is another important piece of the puzzle. Watch carefully and try to remember the arrangement of digits that will now appear. Most likely you will decide that I am mocking you, that such a thing would be impossible in such a short time. However, look at how easily and naturally our closest relatives, chimpanzees, with whom evolution developed us not so long ago, cope with this task. Why is their short-term memory so superior to ours? This phenomenon is sometimes explained by the hypothesis of cognitive compromise. According to this hypothesis, as a result of evolution, the human brain sacrificed phenomenal short-term memory in favor of developing speech. And it may be that language is something much greater than even your boldest fantasies. We are not even capable of noticing, without conscious effort, how strange language really is. For a long time, it was believed that speech was simply a side effect of our hypertrophied intelligence, but reality turned out to be different. For example, the number of languages a person knows says little about the level of their general intelligence. All human communities ever discovered have language, and all of them possess complex and simultaneously strikingly similar grammatical structures. The languages of ancient hunter-gatherers and any tribes are just as complex as popular English, refined French, elaborate Chinese, or Great Russian. If you place a human child in any language environment, then without a single textbook and without teachers, their brain will do everything itself. Calculate the probabilities of sound combinations, words, and rules, and will be able to intuitively complete those rules that no one explained to them. And the child will soon speak on par with everyone else. Scientists still do not understand how this works. Children around the world by 3 or 4 years of age can speak grammatically correctly, and can even create languages more systematic than those they hear. If you somehow restrict children in spoken speech, they will find other ways to create language. For example, sign language. Sign languages are not artificially created, simplified, and adapted versions of spoken speech. No. These are completely new languages that arise everywhere groups of deaf people gather. For example, in the 1980s in Nicaragua, deaf children studying in a special school and having no common language spontaneously created their own full-fledged, complex sign language, which subsequently became one of the main ways of communication for deaf people in the country. This is the only documented case in history of the birth of a new language, and direct proof that our brain possesses an innate program for its creation, which activates when people begin to interact with each other. The cognitive psychologist and psycholinguist Steven Pinker calls this the language instinct. And although different animals have their own means of communication, we have never seen anything even remotely similar to human speech. We now hear that the reasons for the appearance of language are obvious, but actually, scientists are still unable to answer the question, what was the evolutionary necessity for the appearance of speech? What about hunting? Well, wolves and lions, for example, develop sophisticated hunting strategies without grammatical language. Maybe language is needed to find food? Tiny bees successfully communicate about the location and even the value of food sources using a special dance. Maybe language is needed to warn of danger. Well, vervets do not need complex grammar to have warning calls for at least 5 different predators, including leopards, eagles, and snakes. Why did the evolution of our ancestors take such a resource-intensive path and create such disproportionately excessive neural architecture? Moreover, depriving us of our wonderful short-term memory? For what? To spend precious calories on telling stories around the fire, pondering the bones of stars, or debating the subtleties of quantum theory. After all, if you are observant enough, you will notice that most of the time we simply chat, not to transmit useful information. And we derive pleasure from this aimless process. If you think this is some trifle, then actually, speech is one of the most muscularly loaded actions in humans. During conversation, more than 100 muscles work. If you have ever been seriously ill, you know perfectly well how exhausting speech really is. So the desire to wag the tongue from the point of view of the Darwin algorithm is nonsense. The question of the origin of language was so controversial that in 1866, the Paris Linguistic Society issued a ban on considering any works devoted to the problem of the origin of language, considering this problem unsolvable. Since then, we have learned much, but the main question remains unanswered. As has been fairly noted by various authors, including the already mentioned Steven Pinker, as well as anthropologists like Terence Deacon and Robin Dunbar, we either need to understand what decisive advantage language gave early hominids, or abandon hopes for a Darwinian explanation. Something is not right here. This is where we must consider a completely different type of replicator, something that works not through genes, but through imitation and culture. Despite the fact that other animals also to some extent can imitate, this does not compare at all with what humans have. Because what we do is not simply imitation. In the English language, there is a scientific term, Over-imitation, which literally translates as super-imitation. In Russian scientific literature, I have not found a well-established equivalent, although this is very important. So imagine a floor on which stands such a plastic transparent box with a strange construction and a sliding door. Inside the box is a treat, and next to the box lies a stick, and a demonstrator shows what needs to be done to get this treat. He takes the stick, taps it on the box 3 times, moves the upper part of the construction, which does not affect anything, dips the stick 3 times inside the open slot, and only after this opens the door, and with the stick gets the treat. A chimpanzee, seeing this, will skip all the useless steps, simply move the door and grab their prize with their hand. But humans, and especially children, perform all the actions. They take the stick, tap it 3 times on the box, move the upper part of the construction that does not affect anything, push the stick into the slot, and only then open the door, and again with the stick, get the treat. This human behavior has been reproduced dozens of times in experimental conditions, in different countries, with different methodologies, and different ages of participants. Humans, unlike other intelligent animals, almost always repeat all the steps, including even meaningless ones. Even when they understand that a particular action in the algorithm is useless, and even if they were directly told that they do not need to repeat these steps. In other words, humans, unlike all other animals capable of similar imitation, humans not only copy, but do so ritually. Research shows that infants begin to imitate facial expressions, sounds, and gestures from the earliest age, regardless of whether they are encouraged or not. Apparently, successful imitation of something in itself brings us satisfaction. But this imitation ability is not just a minor adaptation. It is the most powerful evolutionary tool ever created, because imitation is universal. If you can successfully copy the making of a stone axe, then you can just as well copy ways of making fire, weaving baskets, making medicines, sewing warm clothing, or any other skill that helps survival. This is as if some animal could copy the sharp hooks from the most toothed animal, the thick skin from the most armored animal, or the immunity from the healthiest of its relatives. In other words, gather all the best innovations of its species. This is an absolutely astonishing ability, and it is no wonder that genes responsible for good imitation began to spread rapidly in the gene pool. But here is something even more profound. Humans are uniquely attracted to stories and narratives. We love films, books, plays, and myths. We spend enormous amounts of time and resources creating and consuming stories. From the perspective of pure biology, this makes no sense, yet it is universal across all human cultures. The comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell analyzed countless myths, legends, and tales from different peoples of the world and came to a remarkable conclusion. Most of them have the same fundamental structure. There is a hero who faces a life challenge, struggles, goes through trials, and returns different, or does not return at all. If you examine this carefully, you will find that many, if not most films, series, books, and so on, regardless of how different they seem, tell variations of this very same story. These structures are called archetypes, very stable mnemonic constructions that the human brain recognizes instantly and unconsciously. For example, you very quickly understand who the hero is, who the villain is, who the wise teacher is, and so on. The human brain has been shaped by these ancient story patterns for thousands of generations, making us exquisitely sensitive to them. This is why we do not care if buildings in a film are drawn with chalk on the floor, if the film uses unrealistic physics or magic, if it is an animated film, or a theater with cardboard sets, or even just a story from Mother Before Sleep, or a myth heard around a fire. If we catch the archetype, then reality ceases to matter. Theater, books, films, series, cartoons, games, comics. Humanity spends tens of billions of dollars and hundreds of trillions of human hours creating and consuming the same stories in different wrappers. What benefit is this for genes? Big question. But for memes, the benefit is obvious. We need only one thing: for the brain to be capable of imitation. Given that capacity, memes will arise that can fully utilize this ability. Approximately 2.5 million years ago, somewhere in the East African savanna, several primates, our ancestors, were breaking bones of dead carcasses with stones. Suddenly, one of them had a rock break, leaving a sharp edge in their hand. Just chance. Nevertheless, now when the primate hit the bone with the sharp edge at a certain angle, each time it produced the desired characteristic crunch. after which this primate immediately received a portion of nutritious bone marrow. The primate itself, possibly, did not understand what was happening and did not realize the cause and effect relationship. But his neighbor, who by fortunate circumstance had a tiny genetic predisposition that slightly increased the density of visual motor circuits in the brain responsible for the connection between seeing and doing. This primate fixed the pattern between the sharp stone, the angle of the blow, and the resulting crunch, and with precision repeated the same thing, getting the same result. He began to use the acquired skill, and thanks to this, ate better, lived longer, and left many children, who also had the tendency to imitate. This trait began to consolidate in the population and strengthen. Of course, this story should not be taken literally. It is only a simplified illustration, but it is important for further understanding. Around 2.5 million years ago, a second replicator appeared on our planet, and apparently, it was precisely this event that led to the appearance of such an anomaly as you. Richard Dawkins in 1976 threw a disturbing thought into the scientific world. He suggested that perhaps something similar, but on an immeasurably grander scale, is happening with us, with the human species. Something lives inside our brains. To understand what exactly, we need to start with the epoch approximately 2.5 million years ago. We need a name for the new replicator, a noun that reflects the idea of a unit of transmission of cultural heritage, or a unit of imitation. From a suitable Greek root comes the word mimime, but I want the word to be monosyllabic, like gene. I hope my classically educated friends will forgive me if I abbreviate mimime to meme. This is Richard Dawkins introducing the concept of memes, units of cultural transmission that replicate from mind to mind, much as genes replicate from cell to cell. Extremely ironically, the name of an entirely new form of life that went beyond carbon-based biology became so distorted in mass consciousness that it was reduced to the designation of funny pictures on the internet. This is equivalent to remembering Pennywise as a children's clown, fever and pain as just a common cold, and Pandora's box as a decorative vase. Because of this, you now do not even remotely understand what mnemonic replicators really are. Memes should be considered as units of information stored in the brain. They have a definite structure, embodied in the material medium of information that our brain uses. Whatever this medium is, if the brain stores information in the form of synapse arrangements, then a meme can theoretically be seen under a microscope as a clearly organized synaptic structure. Yes, scientists do not yet know exactly how the brain encodes information. But even if a meme is a distributed dynamic pattern of electrochemical activity, it is nonetheless absolutely real, material, physical entity located inside the brain. This is not an abstraction. The Darwin algorithm, remember, does not care at all what material the replicator is made of or how it copies itself. Just as gravity does not care what creates it, a stone planet, a gas dust cloud, or even pure energy. According to the concept of universal Darwinism, any system that copies, mutates, competes, and spreads, regardless of its material embodiment, should in the broad sense be considered life. And by all these criteria, mnemonic replicators are alive. These are literally Darwinian replicators. For example, right now I activate a mnemonic parasite that settled in your brain long ago. Sometimes it needs only one sound. If you suddenly felt a craving for cola, that is it. The Coca-Cola replicator, appearing in a small pharmacy in Atlanta in 1866, copied, mutated, competed, and in less than 100 years spread its copies across all continents, billions of times into billions of human heads. As my colleague Nicholas Humphrey elegantly formulated it, memes should be considered as living structures, not only in the metaphorical, but also in the technical sense. Richard Dawkins. So yes, I want to state this once more. However wild this sounds, memes in your head are alive, by definition. In principle, they are the same replicators as genes. Take, for example, the rabies virus. If the plant cover is the habitat of the terrestrial surface, then for the rabies virus, the habitat is the brains of animals. And entering this brain, the virus, being a replicator, remakes the animal's brain for its own needs. Just think about it. This simple replicator, entering the organism of, for example, a dog, completely changes its behavior. The dog becomes aggressive and begins to actively bite. The virus turns off fear in it, so that it does not fear even larger creatures and bites them, transmitting the virus through saliva. Meanwhile, infected with rabies dogs, contrary to expectations, almost never bark, which is useful to avoid scaring away the victim. But besides that, the rabies virus forms a monstrous fear of water in the dog. at the sight and even the sound of water, and especially at the attempt to take a sip. The dog experiences agonizing, painful muscle spasms of the throat and larynx. And since the animal cannot swallow or drink, saliva filled with virus is not washed into the stomach, but accumulates abundantly in the mouth, making the bite maximally contagious. Hence the foam from the mouth of rabid animals. And as you can see in these tragic frames, the rabies virus is able to change the behavior not only of dogs, but also of such a complex creature as a human, causing a panic fear of water and inability to swallow. After such symptoms appear, a person cannot be saved. Therefore, if any street animal bites you, go to the hospital immediately. Rabies is the simplest example of how a replicator, actively copying by method of blind trial and error, derives ever more adapted copies. Copies that are not only well adapted to their environment, but also actively change this environment to allow them to copy even more effectively. Should we expect manifestations of selfishness or cruelty from memes? It turns out we should. In 1985, Coca-Cola was losing competition to Pepsi, largely because people simply preferred the taste of Pepsi. Because of this, the company developed a new cola recipe that in blind taste tests on huge samples, people preferred to the taste of Pepsi, and even to the taste of the original cola. After which, the company began bottling cola according to the new recipe, changing the product name to New Coke, and conducted an extensive public relations campaign, informing people that cola had become much tastier. Contrary to expectations, the public fell into a rage. There were public protests, boycotts, people poured new cola into the streets. The company began receiving tens of thousands of letters and phone calls with complaints and threats. A psychologist hired by the company to analyze the calls noted that people spoke as if discussing the death of a family member. Because of such pressure, just 79 days later, the company returned to the old recipe, which, remember, lost in taste quality. And only after this did the public calm down. As you can see, memes are no less selfish than genes, and they know how to protect themselves. Like the rabies virus that does not allow a person to swallow, the Coca-Cola meme literally did not allow people to drink a more delicious drink. But with memes, everything is much more serious. If the rabies virus changes the behavior of one specific individual here and now, mnemonic replicators for hundreds of thousands of years changed the very genetics of the ancient primate on which they parasitized, forcing its brain and body to gradually mutate for even more efficient copying. You are the result of this almost unnatural process. A serious contribution to the development of the theory of the second replicator was made by English researcher Susan Blackmore. In 1999, she published her work called The Meme Machine, in which she substantially deepened and expanded Richard Dawkins's concept, and did so thoroughly that Dawkins himself emphasized the significance of her work, writing a long foreword to the book. In developing the scenario for this discussion, I relied most heavily on this book, and, as always, tried to make some contribution to developing some of the ideas. Imitation is a super universal skill. If you can successfully copy the making of a stone axe, you can just as well copy ways of making fire, weaving baskets, making medicines, sewing warm clothing, or any other skill helping survival. This is equivalent to an animal being able to copy the sharp hooks from the most toothed animal, the thick skin from the most armored animal, or immunity from the healthiest of its relatives. That is, to gather all the best innovations of its species. This is an absolutely astonishing ability. And it is no wonder that genes responsible for good imitation began to spread rapidly in the gene pool. Now to spread their genes, one needed to adopt the most current and useful memes, particularly inventions and skills that appeared, changed, and became more complex at crazy speed. Genes had to catch up with the demands of memes with maximum possible intensity, increasing the brain. Those who better imitated ever more complex skills survived and passed on their genes. That is, a self-reinforcing cycle occurred. Memes created pressure on genes, selecting people better suited to the mnemonic environment. This made the brain even larger and more suitable for memes. Memes became even more complex and required even more complex brains for their existence. And so round and round. Such coevolution of memes and genes produced our absurd brain, and all those abilities that are difficult to explain only within the framework of biological evolution. The ability to imitate became the most desired quality, and here a turning point occurred. Selection was directed toward those who imitate well for so long that imitation became no longer a means of survival, but the very goal itself. To make this clearer, this can be compared to the role of money. From a tool that was simply supposed to help live, money at some point became that for which people live. Exactly the same happened with the skill of imitation. As you know, primarily women conduct sexual selection because their contribution to offspring is much higher than males. And as Susan Blackmore writes, women increasingly began to prefer not the best hunters, not the strongest or fastest or most enduring members of the tribe, but those who better copied, created, and spread the most viral memes. You can see the result of this right now by the presence of a crazy amount of fans, precisely of actors, musicians, comedians, writers, artists, and other imitators and spreaders of memes, despite the fact that their abilities would be totally useless in the wild. You know what? Let me just give you a thought experiment, after which you will yourself see what the second replicator has actually turned your brain into. Just sit, close your eyes, and observe what begins to happen. You will notice that different thoughts flutter through your head. They come as if from nowhere, and if you try to stop the stream of thoughts, you will understand that this is practically impossible. Thoughts continue even when you want to sleep, concentrate on work, or just sit in silence. And here is a fact that will be especially difficult for you to accept. You could have lived your whole life without realizing that you do not actually choose what thoughts appear in your head in the next moment. This is your brain, but you cannot even predict what you will think about in a second. If it seems to you that this is not so, then ask yourself, what will my next thought be? After this, there will be a pause, and suddenly a thought will appear on its own. This pause is the moment where it becomes clear that you are not producing the thought, but waiting for it. Thoughts simply arise on their own without your participation. One might say, well, I am capable of thinking about something specific. For example, about elephants, yes. But only these thoughts about elephants. Will they be memories from the circus, data from an encyclopedia, or abstract images? All these thoughts will appear spontaneously. You cannot choose which exactly thought about elephants will come into your head. The spontaneous emergence of thoughts explains, for example, why many writers while working feel that their hand is being guided by some external force. Let us move forward. Research shows that almost half a day, that is, collectively almost half of waking life, we are in a state of such passive musing. Obviously, this process should have some function. But what? After all, for the most part, these are some contentless and often repeating thoughts that do not solve any problems at all and only waste resources. Genes would obviously be better off if we could sometimes stop thinking to save valuable calories, or at least get some sleep. From the point of view of meme theory, you cannot control this process, because mnemonic replicators for 2.5 million years created an environment in your brain for their own reproduction. In the end, by growing a brain that constantly shuffles, combines, and reproduces them, completely disregarding the needs of the rest of the organism, the refuge that all memes strive to reach is the human mind. But the human mind itself is an artifact created by memes that restructure the human brain to make it a more favorable habitat for memes. Daniel Dennett wrote this. Arising and replacing each other, thoughts are millions of competing replicators in your brain, which, as is typical for any replicators, aggressively compete for limited resources of their habitat. They try to seize your attention and thereby increase the probability that you will transmit them to someone else. When you get a burning desire to share with a friend some shocking fact or news, and you immediately do this automatically and are almost unable to overcome this impulse, at this moment you are being controlled by a replicator inside your brain that you have been infected with. When you cannot stop humming some song that you possibly do not even like and that even irritates you, you do this not because it benefits you, but because it benefits the replicator inside your brain that is very well adapted to its environment since you cannot do anything about it, and which, like any other replicator, does not care about your desires. Its goal is to copy itself, making you hum the song. It increases the probability that other people will hear it and also become infected, and in turn, infect even more people, and so on. Do you know why exactly sounds are so sticky that they can torment you for days, playing over and over inside your head? Simple mathematics. Sounds turned out to be the most aggressive replicators because of all available ways for a primate to transmit memes, like gestures, facial expressions, or cries. Precisely, cries can transmit far more copies of memes because sound travels a great distance, infecting everyone within range, and does this even without eye contact and even in darkness. Because of such disproportionate effectiveness, sound replicators created the strongest evolutionary pressure, selecting the brain for its ability to hold sounds more accurately and reproduce them better. So the annoying melodies in your head are literally what your brain evolved for, under the pressure of the second replicator. For the same reason, the clumsy sounds that our ancestors produced gradually transformed into rich and grammatically accurate speech. Our ancestors copied the most eloquent and mated with them. That is, language arose primarily as the main tool for spreading mnemonic parasites. The benefit to genes was secondary. It is not accidental that the previously mentioned anthropologist, Terence Deacon, proposed considering language as a living, symbiotic organism. Some linguistic anthropologists believe that religion is a language virus that changes connections in the brain and dulls critical thinking. Do you understand? Yes, where did that person get this idea? But here, everything is not so simple. We literally know that religiosity has a genetic component because, for example, identical twins are more similar in religiosity than fraternal twins. Therefore, there is a possibility that religious mnemonic parasites progressively influenced human evolution. Thus, in quotes, genes related to religiosity could be selected for millennia. Possibly for this reason, an enormous amount of people, even those who do not consider themselves religious, believe in omens, superstitions, astrology, and so on. Thousands of experiments reliably confirmed that all of this does not work. That is, this is absolutely non-adaptive behavior from the point of view of biology. However, it nevertheless exists massively. But the main argument in favor of genes of religiosity is the fact that by various estimates, people professing one religion or another on the planet are about 76%. That is, this is practically a species trait. Although animals sometimes show forms of superstitious behavior, for example, Skinner's pigeons, we have never observed religious behavior in other species. How genes work together to create complex organisms, memes work together to create our complete self. And apparently, competition between memes for access to our brain made us what we are. Daniel Dennett said that the competition of memes for access to our brain made us the creatures we are. Memes are no less selfish than genes, and they are capable of killing their host to facilitate their own spread. Consider known religious martyrs. From the point of view of genes, such behavior is catastrophic. After all, Jesus Christ, as is known, did not leave children. His genes are not in anyone living today, but his memes are embedded in the brain of practically every person on the planet. Moreover, the entire world counts time from the date of his birth. Quite impressive, I must say. Consider the religious community of the Shakers. They are on the brink of extinction because, according to their religion, carnal pleasures are terrible evil. Thus, as you understand, they do not have children. But despite this, their sect has existed for almost 300 years. They especially attract attention with their aesthetic dances, with sharp convulsive movements, cries, and shaking. Actually, that is why they were called Shakers, from the English shake, to shake. Tell me, how principally does the parasite of Shaker religion differ from a parasite called the paradoxical leucochloridium? Entering the organism of a snail, leucochloridium suppresses its reproductive program so that the snail spends energy and resources not on its own offspring, but on the growth, development, and spread of the parasite inside it. Leucochloridium subdues the snail's mind and turns its tentacles into two striking, pulsating appendages. This attracts the attention of birds and helps the parasite end up inside the next host. By analogy, the meme of Shaker religion is essentially a castrating brain parasite that forces the victim to spend time and resources not on their own reproduction, but on the reproduction of the parasite. Like leucochloridium, the Shaker meme brightly attracts attention to its carrier to increase its chances of attracting and infecting the next victim. Genes through the mechanism of aggression force lions and hyenas to defend themselves and attack each other. This is a matter of genetic competition for limited resources. Exactly the same way, mnemonic replicators can cause an attack of aggression in their host when they encounter a host of foreign memes, for example, memes of atheism. From the point of view of genes, fierce disputes between believers and atheists have no sense and are generally dangerous. After all, why should we care about what beliefs someone else has? But no, we fight or even destroy each other in the name of our memes. Remember, for example, countless religious wars. This is what the competition of memes for resources of our attention looks like. Not only religions, but any ideological complexes of memes are ruthless replicators that care only about their own reproduction. It is enough to remember World War II, in which mental parasites arranged a planetary catastrophe, in just 6 years cutting out about 70 million representatives of our species. Or take the confrontation between India and Pakistan. Pakistan acquires latest airplanes, and India immediately does the same. Pakistan increases its navy, and India responds likewise. India develops nuclear weapons. Pakistan immediately takes up the challenge. As a result, the balance is maintained, and billions of dollars are spent not on healthcare and education, but on weapons. What is this? Well, Indians and Pakistanis understood what was happening. Of course they understood. But the arms race is the offspring of Darwinian dynamics, which, as you remember, is practically irresistible. For the same reason, the United States and the Soviet Union, these two gigantic mnemonic formations at the height of the Cold War, accumulated not simply enormous but absurd quantities of nuclear weapons. The United States and the Union had stocks that could guarantee destroy each other literally 100 times over. Creating and maintaining such an arsenal required an immense amount of resources. From the point of view of genes, this is crystallized madness. It simply makes no sense. From the point of view of memes, this is absolute success. Throughout all times, people have been willing to sacrifice themselves in the interests of the mnemonic replicators inhabiting their heads. Here you might say that you are not a slave of memes. And if someone tries to argue with you, you will become angry. This is controlled by a very successful brain parasite about free will. Being an atheist, you will become angry at an attempt to convert you to faith. Being a person of science, you will feel irritated by talk of a flat earth. Being a capitalist, you will feel annoyed by Marxist teachings, and vice versa, and so on forever. Although, it would seem, why should your organism spend even 1 calorie on defending some abstractions? Possibly because they are just as abstract as parasites and viruses. Temples and cathedrals exist throughout the world, built over centuries and sometimes millennia. The Notre Dame Cathedral took nearly 2 centuries to build. The Cologne Cathedral took more than 600 years. These magnificent structures took enormous resources and centuries of human labor. Yet from the point of view of genes, temples contribute almost nothing directly to gene spread. To understand how the Darwin algorithm produced temples, aliens would have to look not at the human genome, but at our brain. Then it would become obvious that these grand structures are the responsibility of the second replicator, which creates these buildings through human bodies to extremely effectively spread its own copies, affecting potential hosts through their sense of beauty, sacredness, existential anxiety, need for meaning, and so on. As genes, transforming the tentacles of snails into bright pulsating baits, cooperate with genes suppressing self-preservation instinct and genes of reproduction, and as all these cooperating genes form a single symbiotic organism called leucochloridium, so too do memes of meaning in life cooperate with memes of fear of death, desire for justice, obedience to authorities, and belonging to a group. And all these memes together form whole symbiotic systems that we call religions, and which from the point of view of memetics, most effectively use the features of the human brain for their own copying. Humans are not blank slates. We are still halfway biological creatures. For example, even blind from birth, men prefer women with a low waist-to-hip ratio. This is formed by ordinary genetic evolution and preference. Hypothetically, it protects male genes from investing resources in already pregnant women, not buy them. Similarly, women genetically prefer men with a certain physique that suggests physical strength and dominance. And there are videos on my channel about how much our lives are determined by genes, and nearly 90 minutes of video about how much in us comes from animals. However, take a tiger cub, raise it in isolation, and it will still become a tiger. Any animal, even raised in complete solitude, will know everything its species should know. But isolate a newborn human, and they will not be able to speak, think abstractly, or interact with other people. They will not develop personality or probably self-consciousness. That is, if any of us were raised in isolation, outside of culture, then we would not exist. These would be empty biological shells. Numerous examples with feral children confirm this. For example, Dina Seneca, raised with wolves, after discovery moved on 4 limbs, growled, snarled, made wolf sounds, and preferred raw meat. No wonder. because genetically we are machines for super-imitation. Children raised in isolation raise a profound philosophical question. Are they human? Genetically, certainly, but it seems that our very human essence is formed not by genes at all. To become human, a representative of Homo sapiens must from birth copy and absorb an enormous amount of memes existing within our society. And therefore, actually, it is meaningless to say only that memes parasitize on us. Partially this is indeed so. However, first and foremost, as Susan Blackmore writes in a quote, memetics should not become a science of mental viruses. Moreover, the vast majority of memes, like the vast majority of genes, cannot at all be considered viral. They are the very essence of our mind. Our memes are us. Susan Blackmore wrote this. Mnemonic replicators form our personality, just as genetic replicators form our body. We fiercely defend our memes, not because they are true, but because they are part of us, like a hand or leg. Blackmore agrees with Daniel Dennett, who says that our mind and our self are created by the interaction of memes. Memes not only copy like genes, but human consciousness itself is a product of memes. Dennett said that the very competition of memes for access to our brain made us what we are. If you free the infected person in The Last of Us from the fungus that changed them inside, it will not help them, because there is already no one to free. Exactly the same way, memes for thousands of years of evolution hollowed out the body of an ancient primate and used that body as an environment for their own replication. If now we try to free the primate from the mnemonic replicators that changed it inside, it will not help the primate, because there is already no one to free. Thus, you appeared. A new form of life. The only creature on the planet born from an exotic and almost unnatural symbiosis of two replicators. You know, it seems very strange that we are the only survivors from the genus Homo. As biologist Peter Richardson and anthropologist Robert Boyd wrote, what is wrong with culture if it should be truly noticeable only in one species? After all, Neanderthals had brains even somewhat larger than ours. They made tools, buried their dead, possibly even made rock paintings, and had some rudiments of speech. But Neanderthals no longer exist. No one knows for certain why exactly they went extinct, but it is quite possible that having two replicators in one body is too nuclear a symbiotic mixture, which so far has been possible to stabilize only in one species. Possibly, one should not naively believe that when a species evolves that uses memes, it is necessarily destined for a long life. Just as with genes, memes have no foresight. In the process of diverting our energy from genes, they can simply destroy us. Susan Blackmore wrote this. So we stand out so much against other animals. Our truly dual nature explains why we are so torn in eternal internal contradictions, and even why we intuitively feel that our personality and our body are not one and the same. Just as genes, interacting with each other, form a single organism, memes, doing the same thing, create our complete self. And apparently, the integration of memes is largely the responsibility of that very expanded by mnemonic replicators prefrontal cortex. Apparently, it is precisely thanks to the prefrontal cortex that we feel ourselves as one whole, not as a bunch of scattered memes. And if we push the thought to its limit, then damage to the prefrontal cortex does not kill a human as a biological organism, but kills or cripples them as a mnemonic organism. Schizophrenia, from ancient Greek, means splitting. Splitting is precisely what happens to the personality created by memes when the prefrontal cortex malfunctions. About 80% of patients begin to hear voices, and these voices are felt by the patients as absolutely, I emphasize absolutely real, and not without reason. Research shows that these voices behave as completely autonomous agents. They have different personalities, different histories, remember context, can command, threaten, become smarter over time, and develop new tactics of influence. There can be several voices, and they can argue with each other. Interestingly, in both men and women, voices are most often male. Why? Because a more dominant male voice more easily attracts attention. For the same reason, voices most often say something negative. These are more replicative memes that displace all others, force themselves to be heard, and try to change the behavior of the host, forcing them to do something or not do something. Schizophrenic voices are a rare catastrophic case where we literally observe memes as they are, in their wild, uncontrolled form. And in my view, this is one of the most striking examples that memes are not simply information, but evolving agents. Even if you are healthy, how many times has a thought that you initially wanted to reject slowly sprouted in your consciousness, evolved, and ultimately become part of you? Considering the amount of work memes have done and the speed of their evolution, one must ask where the second replicator will lead humans in the near future, and whether it will still need human bodies for copying. After all, what we call an organism is just another temporary way for selfish replicators to copy themselves as many times as possible. As you can see, the issue is not that human existence is inexplicable from the point of view of natural selection, but that Darwinism is possibly a far greater theory than we thought. Some, far from marginal scientific hypotheses, even assert that Darwin's law is so fundamental that it not only generates life in all corners of the cosmos, but actually stands above all reality, literally selecting entire universes with different laws of physics by their ability to create new universes. Daniel Dennett called Darwin's idea dangerous because it robs us of comforting illusions about our special place in the world, answering not only the question of the origin of life, but also the question of the origin of mind. To summarize, the existence of our species does not refute the theory of evolution, but twice confirms it. At least, such is the concept. The future remains unknown. The second replicator continues to evolve at astonishing speed. Whether humanity will remain the primary vehicle for meme propagation, or whether memes will find new ways to replicate independent of human biology, is a question for the future. What is clear is that we are caught in the middle of one of the most profound evolutionary transitions in the history of life on Earth. We are not simply the products of evolution. We are the arena in which evolution itself is taking on a new and more powerful form. Understanding this dual nature of our existence, this symbiosis between genes and memes, may be essential if we are to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.